we go. That should have fixed the problem, hopefully. And let me just take that nasty message that says computer audio connected, audio setting. Let's just take it out of the way. There we go. And I'm hoping that has fixed the problem for our joiners on our LinkedIn live channels. Please let us know if it hasn't. There we go. So without further ado, we're going to start this very important topic, and I'm going to start by allowing the panelists to introduce themselves. So why don't we start with you, Prof. Graham, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for the invitation to be on this panel with some amazing women. I'm very privileged to join you. So I think you've already given a little bit of my background, but the reason I'm on this panel is because I'm really passionate about finding solutions to the issue of youth unemployment in South Africa and beyond, and have been working on quite a lot of research looking at what are some of the key drivers and what can we do to innovatively solve the problem of youth unemployment.
Thank you, Lauren. Yasmin.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to talk to you all. My name is Yasmin. I'm calling in from Accra, where the borders just opened today for air travel. So there's a sense of excitement here in Accra at the moment. I founded Africa Foresight Group in 2016. And Africa Foresight Group is a company that is at the forefront of the future of work, a very popular term these days, because we're really trying to build a platform for top freelancers across the continent to support businesses across the continent. And I'm here today because I'm very passionate about the question how we can open up labor markets and make them borderless so that we can solve unemployment crises like the one we have in South Africa with a lot more fluidity. Nice to meet you all and looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, meanwhile, I hope the weather is better on this first spring day in Accra, and if so, maybe we need to get on a plane and come and visit, because it's very depressing in Joburg today.
Unfortunately, it's not much better here. I have to disappoint you. That's why I'm already looking for flights.
Well, we hope to see you in Joburg soon, Yasmin. And then, last but not least, Rapelang.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Really a pleasure to be here. I guess I'm here because I've had a long-term interest in how we scale and capacitate young people. I think while Africa shows tremendous promise in the coming years, unless we fundamentally change the pace at which we can reskill, a number of young people will be left behind. So I guess my dream and belief is that we've got to be able to use technology to leverage solutions that can be delivered at scale. And while we solve small, localized problems, solutions that can address hundreds of millions of young people will have to leverage technology, and that's the pursuit I've been on to discover.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, ladies. We're very glad that you're here. And so without further ado, let's start tackling this issue. So maybe first off, Lauren, I can ask you, let's define the problem. So what is the definition of youth employment? Who exactly are we talking about when we're talking about the youth, and what does unemployed mean? Oh, Lauren, just take yourself off unmute.
It's the phrase of the year. I'm sorry, I was muted. So if we're talking about international definitions of youth, we generally use the age range of 15 to 24 years old. And so I'm going to stick to that because the conversation today is not just about South Africa, it's about the wider continent. And so 15 to 24 gives us more comparable figures. But in the South African context, given our expanded definition of youth, we do sometimes take that up to 34 years. When we talk about youth unemployment, there's two key issues to think about. When we have a strict definition of youth unemployment, we're only looking at young people who have been looking for work in the past 7 days or a month, depending on how the survey looks at the question. I prefer to use the expanded definition of youth, and that includes young people who've given up looking for work. And the reason I prefer to use that definition is because in the conversations we have with young people, we see how many people are giving up looking for work, which is a very worrying thing amongst young people. Young people should be passionate and excited to be working, and many of them are, but the barriers they face mean that we're seeing increasing discouragement levels amongst young people, and that in itself is something to solve.
Yeah, that's terrible when you're looking for your purpose and there's no opportunity for you to find your purpose.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the numbers. So I know South Africa, unfortunately, holds the first prize. They've won first prize here and hasn't been looking great from a global perspective as well as from a continent perspective for the last couple of years. What are we looking at from an unemployment level perspective right now within our youth?
So when we looked at the figures that came out just before our lockdown, we were looking at a 59% youth unemployment rate for young people aged 15 to 24, including those who've given up looking for work. And that is likely to get a lot worse, given that we're due to see quite a big contraction in the economy. And we know internationally that young people are the first to lose their jobs and the last to gain them back. We saw that in the global economic recession in the 2008-2009 internationally, and we're likely to see it again internationally now. And so we're yet to see what the figures are going to look like at the national level, but we did run a short survey, and I have to give credit here to UNICEF and to Saldrew at UCT for this survey, that looked at how many young people had lost jobs, and 43% of the respondents said that they weren't paid during lockdown, and 26% were not paid in full. 24% had lost their jobs, 42% were unclear if they still had their jobs. So amongst the sample that we reached, very dire circumstances that they're facing. So we're likely to see that figure jump quite a lot in the next quarterly labour force survey that comes out. But that we are the worst in Africa and across emerging economies. If we look at other emerging economies, the rates sit at around 15% or so. And interestingly enough, low-income countries in Africa have the lowest youth unemployment rates, but that is because there's no social safety nets, security nets, and so young people have to engage in very precarious and not decent work to ensure that there's some income coming into the household. So that's not something to aspire to necessarily.
I hear you. And maybe let's talk about these drivers. So and Yasmin, feel free to jump in here from a rest of Africa perspective. But Lauren, what are the drivers in South Africa for this number that just keeps growing and is now just being exacerbated by COVID-19?
So we can look at the demand side, and demand side generally, we have not seen a lot of job growth in the economy. Where we have seen economic growth that has been gone hand in hand with low job growth, some job growth, but low job growth. So we're not creating enough jobs for the number of young people coming through the system. We also know that those young people are going to enter the labour market at the back of the queue. So from a demand side, we are not seeing the job growth that we need to absorb, and that's largely some of the researchers would argue that that's because we haven't seen enough growth in the secondary sectors, your manufacturing. So we've seen quite a large growth of jobs in your tertiary sectors, but those are jobs that require higher levels of skills, which I'm sure Rapilang will talk to a little bit more. And our education system doesn't prepare young people for the kinds of skills that they need to be entering the labour market. And there's a distrust of our education system. So even if young people exit the education system with their matric, there's a distrust of that matric. And so employers tend to lift the barriers to entry in order to sort that, because they don't trust the matric certificate. So that happens on the supply side as well, that young people don't enter the labour market with the required skills, even the most basic required skills, particularly if young people exit the labour market, exit the schooling system early. And they also face what we often overlook is the range of barriers that young people face. They are not simply work seekers. They are whole young people. Many of them have care responsibilities. Many of them live far away from work opportunities. We did a study 2 years ago, which showed that young people were spending more than their per capita household income on work seeking, for instance. They come from food insecure households often. So there's a range of barriers that they face before we can even get them into training opportunities or labor market opportunities. And we often overlook all of those barriers and don't address those because we simply see a young person as a work seeker.
So I really want to pick up on that point around distrust around the education system and potentially how we can do things better. So I'm going to pin that, and Rapelang, I'm coming for you a little bit later in this conversation. But maybe, Yasmin, you can just give me a view on the talent pool that is out there, because clearly it's not lack of talent or lack of people. South Africa, the continent, is one of the youngest populations in the world. So it is the structural barriers, or is it a combination of lack of talent and structural barriers?
So, I mean, at AFG, we are currently building a platform that focuses on very highly qualified talent. And I think for that, the story is a bit different because we're looking for the top 3% of consultants across the continent. So I would not use that as an example for my answer, because I think the big pool is somewhere else. But for me, the big issue really is the exorbitant mismatch that Professor Graham already just mentioned between the number of jobs we're creating and the number of people that enter the labor market every year. The Mo Ibrahim Foundation published a study on that last year, saying that in Africa, we create on average 3 million jobs per year, but we have 18 million entering the job market every year. So the mismatch is exorbitant, and the competition you're creating for the few formal workplaces that are available is just not sustainable. So the big question for me, to be honest, is more about how we can think way beyond our current horizon and talk about what are the global opportunities where our workforce can play a role. Because even if you look at South Africa before COVID-19 had just started to enter a recession, sadly. So if we now focus on just recovering to previous COVID-19 levels when it comes to our economy, we will still not have solved the problem, because in South Africa, the statistics look similar, that the number of people entering the job market every year is 3 times as high as our GDP growth and corresponding job growth. So the question really has to be, how can we create skills and train people to have skills that they can use in a global job market? For me, questions like creation of online labor platforms, offshoring, are really interesting. I know that the offshoring debate has taken off quite significantly in South Africa over the years. But one thing I miss in that, in many instances, is to also look at the pathway question. So if you say that you're building a global work opportunity that a South African young person can fill remotely without having to move, then how do you also make sure that it's a decent job that gives you skills that you can then use to further grow your career? This is something that we also learned at AFG, because in the beginning, we just built a freelancer network, but after just a few months, we realized that that alone doesn't cut it, because the people start getting bored. You have to constantly build pathways, even if it's a freelancer, not a full-time employee, so that they stay with you. So I'm very much here today to talk about this global opportunity question and how we can put the brilliant people we have to global work.
And I think, that the refrain that is becoming louder and louder is the one around COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 is, it's equal the playing field. It really is an opportunity for us to build back better. Keeping all these structural barriers in mind, and starting as it is from scratch, because that is where we are starting from. So you may as well take the opportunity now to rebuild. So let's talk about some of the programs out there. And I know everybody wants to hear from Rapelang, because she's got the coolest part of this conversation around the tech, but we've got to get through the dry stuff first. That's how I'm keeping you guys here. So maybe, Lauren, maybe you can just take us through some of the programs, because we haven't only started talking about this now. I mean, we've got the Presidential Youth Unemployment Unit that was put in place some time back. So I know there are a couple of programs that are already running in South Africa. the University of Joburg and the Centre of Social Development has done some significant work there. But perhaps just give us some sense of what is happening in the South African market to try and address this problem.
I think for me, that is one of the great sides of the story, besides young people's own ambitions and agency, is that South Africa has invested a huge amount in addressing the youth unemployment problem. So if we just look at the state, for instance, the employment tax incentive, and if there's anybody here from small businesses, I would highly encourage you to look into the employment tax incentive, is one such example. And then there's a whole host of things happening in the state, in the private sector, in civil society that are trying to address the youth unemployment problem. A large part of those are on skills development on the supply side of the labour market, and that's very necessary. Far too little is happening on the demand side of the labour market. And so, Yasmin, as you were talking, I was thinking, yes, absolutely, we need to be coming up with solutions on the demand side of the labour market. Having said that there's a lot happening on the supply side of the labour market, that is not always very coordinated. So what we find is that a young person will go through a training opportunity, they'll try and find a job, they won't get anywhere, they'll try another training opportunity, and there's no sense of what is this building towards. And so coordination around that is really important. And that's where the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention comes in, which was launched earlier this year. And that is trying to bring key partners in the youth unemployment space together so that there's a single sign-on point, that young people get assessed once off, and then they get passed to various different partners in that network of partners. And if there's anybody who wants to know more about that during the Q&A, I can give some more details. But a significant gap in our offerings is in the intermediation. And what I mean by intermediation is, how do we bring young people closer to employers and vice versa? And there's been some interesting work done about how the importance of reference letters and how that can flag better information to employers, for instance. And there's some really great startups that have looked at bringing employers and young people closer together. The work that we're doing is targeting a very neglected group. And this is what we call young people who are not in employment, education, and training. They're typically young people who are in that discouraged group, who may have had repeated failures and they've given up. They've been let down by various different services. And our aim with what we're calling the basic package of support for niche youth in South Africa is to reach out to them, to reconnect them into whatever service they need to take the next step in their journey. And that may not be a training or a labour market journey at this stage. They might need help with other things before they can connect to the labour market or a training opportunity. And that's a real gap in the interventions that needs to be addressed, is helping young people with that navigational capacity in what is a very complex labour market and training system.
Fantastic. And maybe just to interject there for a second, because I'm seeing the questions are starting to come in through the chat and the Q&A. For those of you who joined us late, please add them there. If your question is relevant to something that we're discussing right now, raise your hand. Pius Tech 4, I see that you've raised your hand. If it's relevant for right now what we're discussing, keep it raised. There we go. You're talking. You permitted to talk. Pius, you want to tell us quickly what you were thinking while the panelists were chatting? Oh, Pius, I see you must unmute yourself. I just asked you to unmute. Unmute yourself and then you can ask. Okay, Pius, if you're ready again, put your hand up. Let's keep the conversation going. But I think, so feel free to put your little blue hand up. You'll see it, it's there at the bottom of your screen, or if you click on your name, you should be able to lift it. Ben, I see that you have raised your hand. I'm going to allow you to talk. Unmute yourself, let's go.
Afternoon, ladies. Thanks for a very illuminating discussion so far. Okay, so my question is like this, right? Say if people like you, they'll listen to you, but if they trust you, they'll do business with you. So I'm just curious, is it coincidence that the demographics of jobs lost is female and black? Or are we to conclude that the reason for the demographic of the unemployed is because they possess less skills? Or is it just a function of numbers? Anyone could answer.
Ben, you never ask
Shall
the
I
easy
do?
questions, do you? Go for it, Laura.
Certainly the demographics do show that it's young women and young Black men and women who are most affected by job losses and by unemployment. And that is a complex issue to unpack. Partly that has to do with the Africanization of poverty in South Africa, and the related nature of that with quality of schooling in South Africa. So there's a whole lot of interrelated inequalities there. There's evidence internationally around women being less preferred in the labor market, and particularly at this age, which is a reproductive age. But in the research that we've done on South Africa, there's actually very little evidence that unpacks these issues, and certainly which unpacks questions of prejudice amongst employers. There's insufficient research to point to that. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not happening. It means that we don't have the evidence to show that it is or isn't happening. And so that's certainly an area where there should be more research looking at that. We do see that young women who have children are less likely to continue in their education trajectory, but we don't know what the link with that is with employment. It's likely that it affects employment.
I mean, I don't necessarily have the statistics like Lauren does, but I think for me, anecdotally, I do think that when businesses do go through sort of challenging times, it seems that they resort back to who they know and who they've trusted for a longer period, and it almost closes ranks. So suddenly it was nice to have you, but now, you know, things have gotten serious. And I think for me, that speaks to the compounded issue of when you mention skills, I don't know if it's skills per se, but if you were sort of in those minority groups, were you given the opportunities for exposure? Were you on the best projects? Have you built the skills over the 5 years you've been in that organization? And even if you came in with the requisite skills, that exposure or experience component, I think, is key to really make you competitive in the marketplace.
I think that's right. And maybe just to add on to what Lauren was saying earlier, there are so many factors playing into this, Ben, and maybe for everybody's elucidation, if you didn't know this, but I think most women do, women on average in this country are getting paid 35% less than their male counterparts for doing the exact same job. And that is not something new. That is something that has been going on for the last 2 decades. So just think about the social impact that has in a country where almost half, if not more, of households are female-led. That means that female-led households looking after children and elderly and other extended family are on average 40% poorer than male-led households. I'll leave that for you to think about. Ben, thank you for your question. I see that Robert Colorino also has his hand up. Robert, I'm going to allow you to ask your question, and then I'm going to move the conversation forward because I really want to hear what Yasmina's doing. And of course, we want to get to Rapelan because she's doing the really cool stuff. So, Robert, I've asked you to unmute yourself. Go for it.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Okay, excellent. A little bit on COVID. Maybe there's some silver lining here on this restart with respect to retraining, and I guess the integration of both education and technology for both the youth that are unemployed, but more so that were on furlough with COVID. This is an opportunity to perhaps retrain, put resources around that. I'd be curious on the panel input, towards that, and maybe improvements of that model from a multi-country basis, if possible. Thank you.
So, Robert, thanks for that. And maybe that's a nice segue, Yasmin, into the question I wanted to ask you, because I know that AFG, your group, is doing some interesting thinking around how we could potentially use the youth and think about the youth and reskilling them into opportunities that exist on the continent.
Sure. I mean, Thanks for passing on, Melanie. So from our side, we think that COVID-19 is accelerating a trend that we've already seen before. We have had quite a good insight into the Indian offshoring market, and what we have been seeing for the last 2 years, but probably it's also been a trend prior, is that in India, the cost of living has increased over the past years, and as a result, the cost of services you can get from the Indian market has increased when it comes to price. So we have been thinking about the question for years, how we could possibly find a way to get a share of the offshoring market onto African soil. Now COVID-19 came. COVID-19 has obviously led to a huge economic depression in a lot of markets around the world. But the offshoring sector is one of the few sectors that are actually expected to grow from this crisis. And the reason for that is that you are now looking at a number of organizations that have to tighten their belts and are looking for cost-saving opportunities to see how they can actually get through the crisis. And offshoring, in most cases, is a cost-saving initiative. So in a way, it's now further accelerated the opportunity that we've been seeing even prior to COVID-19. Now, the reason why we think that this is so interesting for particularly the angle of youth unemployment is the type of employment that you can drive through offshoring. I think the classic thing that people usually associate with offshoring, first of all, is call centers. Now, we've done quite a bit of research around different types of offshoring services. And to be honest, call centers is unfortunately one of those that, of course, have some market volume that you can drive, an opportunity you can drive. But when it comes to what I mentioned earlier in my contributions, the quality and decency of work, call centers are unfortunately not the one that is generally upskilling people for a proper pathway. It's a very, very monotonous, recurring type of job where you don't necessarily build skills that necessarily give you access to other types of work opportunities. So what we're currently doing at AFG is trying to conceptualize an offshoring center solution that we are looking to pilot in South Africa that looks at the offshoring question a little bit more differently, where it's really about combining offshoring services with also a training program for 2 years. We think it's a huge opportunity because just capturing 1% of the global offshoring market would already be 40,000 jobs. I mean, that's a pretty good number, I think. And we're really trying to see how you can kind of broaden the conversation about what kind of services we are talking about here. There is, of course, the software development bit, but to be honest, that is very complex and a very long pathway to get people to be able to effectively do it. So we think that to high and skill level. But there are other digital types of offshoring services such as e-cataloging or digitization of marketplaces that are an interesting skills opportunity for youth and at the same time have a huge growing market that is tied to the Amazons of this world. There are also more exotic ideas, for instance, how you can offshore pensioners' care. We all know that the US, Germany, the UK, most of the Western societies are aging rapidly. They have the opposite problem of what we have, and they're totally lacking the capacity to take care of all their pensioners. 70% of pensioners in the US have a smartphone. So what can you do with that? So really also trying to see how you could really push the needle beyond the classic notion of offshoring to make it an interesting work opportunity. And we think it's time to try and start something that can showcase this and hopefully contribute to building a full industry out of that in South Africa and other African markets.
I think that's amazing. And maybe Rapelan, just talking about that, there's clearly some learnings and skills transfer that's going to have to happen to take proper advantage of this opportunity that Yasmin is referring to. Maybe just quickly take us through how Rekindle Learning came to be and what your thinking behind that was, and how Rekindle is positioned to assist what Yasmin is referring to.
Sure. So I guess Rekindle for me has been that dream baby to try figure out how we really, really leverage technology to give results. You know, I think old school e-learning was about putting digital textbooks online, putting some PDFs and slides online, and it wasn't really changing how people interact with content, which I believe was fundamental if you wanted to reduce the time to competency and build skills quicker. So for us, I think we've played a lot more in the sort of employee enablement, post-matric sort of skill level, mainly because I didn't want to go into basic education because, as you've already mentioned, the matric isn't a strong enough signal anyway. So getting people to get a stronger matric wasn't going to make a fundamental shift in my mind. And we needed to focus a lot more on how, given this strong millennial generation going into corporates now, can we design solutions that can make them upskill them quicker and make them more compelling as employees within large corporations. So a lot of the work that we've done with our corporate clients has really been focused on continuous learning solutions using our bite-sized learning approach. So instead of giving people stuff to read, which we know they never read, how do you get it through short videos, interactive questions, and for the organization to really track the level of activity engagement, which is a real sort of cursor to whether that knowledge will be applied. And this is a sort of a big shift from traditional training where you just sign a register and you've got no real appreciation of what people have understood. And by doing less reading, it's less passive, which for this generation is going to be quite key. So we find that young people who may have battled, for example, to get certain regulatory qualifications in financial services are able to do so using our platform. Or sales and product training enablement. How do you get people quicker onboarded like that? So that's been a helpful intervention for us. But I think the issue of unemployment is really, really much bigger. And I think that some of the issues that we're seeing in corporates is that while people talk about wanting digital skills and collaboration and communication or all of these other terms we throw around, part of the issue, I think, is that we haven't really developed a good detailed architecture or dictionary of what those really mean. So what determines a great collaborator versus an average one versus a not so good one? Because if we don't have those clear, it means you don't know how to train and develop for them, and you can't reward people adequately for those skills of the future that we say that we want. And I really sort of have been banding around the idea of a digital skills architecture that can help us do that. Because until it's defined, it means you can't recruit clearly for it and the signaling is wrong in the market. It means you can't proactively train for it. So then it's, leaving it to chance. You hope you're in a strong team with a great manager who's a great coach, and maybe you'll pick it up. So again, access and privilege will determine who comes out. And then be able to remunerate for it and keep them sort of employed. I think a lot of the really talented people are also leaving corporations, which they're fine, I guess, but we haven't really figured out how we build those retention schemes either. So yeah, it's a multifaceted problem in that respect.
Harry, Mashele, who's just joined us from LinkedIn at For Africa Group Holdings, had a quick question here saying, how do we see the digital divide playing itself out going forward? Are we confronted with even more worrying prospects for youth, especially Black youth?
Yeah.
I guess that's where we are.
Yeah, I'm hoping that post this COVID experience, government and policymakers, as well as mobile operators, will really, really come to appreciate that access to data isn't a nice to have at all. And I think up until this point, it hasn't been seen to be absolutely crucial. But now we've seen that poorer schools and middle income schools were not able to continue with learning programs, as well as the privileged schools, because of access to devices and internet access. And this, if we don't fix those infrastructure gaps, the digital divide will certainly get a lot bigger. But even after that, I think a lot of the time when we look at e-learning or technology-related initiatives, it's all about the infrastructure, which I do not deny is absolutely critical. But then we still actually have to understand, what are people going to experience on these tablets that you buy, on these mobile phones? And what is the learning pedagogy that we are saying will work? And what aspects of the curriculum are we targeting? Because I think we get stuck in an idea that just give them a tablet and by osmosis they'll get smarter. But we actually don't look at, there's multiple stages to the learning process. Which ones are we saying we're targeting with this tablet? Which ones are we saying we're doing in the classroom? Which ones do we need to do in projects? And for me, when we get to a more nuanced conversation that can look deeper, then we can actually say, let's do the infrastructure, let's do the learning experience, then we can actually get to outcomes.
I hear you. And I see all the panelists are nodding their heads. Perfect.
Yeah,
Lauren.
I think the digital divide question is a really, really important one, because it can be a leveler, or it can really deepen existing inequalities. And as Rapelang has said, so far we've seen a deepening inequalities in the education system. And we do really need to think carefully. It is an infrastructure question, but some of the research that my colleague Ariana has done has also shown, we tend to think that young people are tech savvy, give them a tablet and they'll fly. But actually, young people need help to understand how to curate information. What is good information? What is bad information? And then, of course, we've got all the data expenses that go hand in hand in that. So it really is important to think through carefully, how do we deliver with digital technology in order to level the playing field adequately.
Absolutely. And I'm just, I was having a quick look at some of the participants and the diversity of the participants on this webinar today. And maybe we need to have a conversation around our immediate spheres of influence, because we are surrounded by communities where youth unemployment is prevalent. So in our immediate spheres of influence, maybe we need to draw it back for a second and to say, what is it that persons active in the private equity and the venture capital space, the investee companies that they invest into, can think about when they think about youth unemployment in South Africa and more wider on the continent, specifically, as you've highlighted, given this demand gap that seems to be prevalent. Who wants to give it a first bash? Lauren, can I? Oh, Yasmin has put her hand up. Yasmin, go for it.
Yeah, I'm doing it old school now. So this is a very interesting question that we've recently spent quite a bit of time on. And there are two things I'd love to mention here. The first thing really is that in recent years, it seems private equity funds and also venture capitalists have realized the need for a lot more focus on human capital development in their portfolio, where it was before more of a question of trying to hire a search firm to find a good CEO and then trying to see if it works to get a return. It is now a lot more about being a partner for your portfolio on a constant basis to see how you can develop human capital. And I mean, we spoke about the question of youth today. We also spoke about the question of gender parity today. I think that there's a lot investment funds can do to showcase the business case of gender parity and youth inclusion in the workforce. Because if the human capital side of a business is not working, no matter how big the opportunity is, that multiple you want to have is just not going to work out the way you planned. So I do think that there's a big role to play for PE and VC funds when it comes to being a human capital partner that helps to think about these things and puts them onto the agenda, even if there are a myriad of other topics. Now, the other thing that I think is worth mentioning, though, and I've been preaching that to some of the PE funds and VCs that we're working with, is really also trying to reconsider the investment thesis they have and not only focusing on the African market. Obviously, the African market has a lot of opportunity, and I don't want to, degrade that at all, but I'm half German, and Africa and Germany have the same GDP. So, I mean, if you want to see African businesses really scale and become big brands that can create a lot of employment, you need to look at your potential investments from a global standpoint as well, instead of just thinking about what market opportunity it can capture within Africa. So, and I think that offshoring is something that a lot of PE funds and VCs, for instance, should start to look at, because there are a lot of opportunities in it. And it's also beautiful low capital business where you can definitely get a nice return.
Yes, in a world that's looking for return multipliers, why aren't we focusing a little bit harder on this as one of the issues? Rapelang, you wanted to say something.
Sure. I think while South Africa has a very well-developed private equity market, I think we still have a way to go in the venture capital space, mainly because I think the risk profile or the risk capital that's available isn't quite there to fund the really revolutionary innovations. And I say that in the sense that I don't know if most of you have read Clayton Christensen's book, The Prosperity Paradox, but obviously he emphasizes again, efficiency and market creating innovations. And when we look at the fact that the people that we're trying to reach are currently underserved, they're not part of an economic ecosystem, they're not part of a value chain, it has to be a market creating innovation. And my deep concern around the funding space is that most of our funders are really looking at efficiency and sustaining innovations that serve an existing market where there's a historical understanding, and therefore you can project your ROI based on that. Whereas market creating innovations, there's no consumption. So you can't use those financial frameworks to actually figure out whether you will invest or not. And this leaves us quite vulnerable, because I think then, it's mainly foreign investors that are willing, in my conversations, to look at those, as opposed to African investors. And this is where the real market opportunities are. It's not in improving what people are currently consuming. It's in reaching people that are currently completely not served. And that's a longer timeline for return. While we already have long timelines in Africa, 5-7 years, this is 10-15 year sort of outlook to really build a business up there. And I think we need to have a much more substantive conversation there around how we specifically look at market creating innovations. An example that I thought was cool in the South African context is the other startup, Giraffe, for example. They do a lot of recruitment for young people. And what I found cool using that platform was that a young person can answer a question using, a WhatsApp voice note, which is a lot more accessible way for them to be seen and positioned and understood, in addition to that CV, of course. I mean, for me, that's an important thing, where you figured out what can we get from this young person who's all the way in the middle of nowhere, perhaps, that allows them to get a flavor of who they are and do this at scale. And I believe they now have sort of 10 million young people that sort of have on their database. And for me, those are the kinds of things we need to be looking at and having the patient capital for.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, sorry, Lauren, go for it. Add in.
Now, I was going to echo those kind of innovative companies that are looking to bridge that supply-demand side, so that are filling that intermediation gap, which is definitely a gap, are crucial to be investing in. And there are some lovely ones, Giraffe being one of them, JobJack being another, that have popped up and that are really important, and that have that view of getting over the barriers for young people, so that young people are not having to jump through the hoops all the time, but they're trying to address those barriers. The other point I wanted to make is that I think small businesses are absolutely crucial in economic growth. And in fact, if we look at the prior to COVID, the statistics of young people who are employed, 2/3 of them medium-sized businesses. So they are crucial employers, and simply supporting them. And I think what we underestimate is the unrecognized training that such organizations do, on-the-job training, that then might lead to something else for young people. And they are often the ones that are facing the highest levels of risk, who don't know about things like the employment tax incentive, who don't have the capacity necessarily to jump through the bureaucratic hoops to apply for them. But those are the kind of companies that are really going to be driving this in the future that we need to be investing in. And then a little bit of out from left field is, if there's appetite, there's also social return on investment. And I wonder whether there's anybody out there who would be interested in supporting organizations who are providing really good training and support to young people in local communities, are crucial and are really are always challenged with fundraising, but are really under a lot of strain due to COVID-19. And those are going to be crucial connection points when we want to reach young people who are underserved. Those are the places where we are able to reach them through, and who are providing services. And perhaps there's appetite to support those kinds of organizations as well.
So the private equity funds with the deep pockets. Lauren is hoping that she's been heard. Reach out.
And Melanie, we only need actually less than 1% allocations. And for me, what's staggering is that private equity firms are still not putting even a 1% allocation for venture capital. And that's staggering. So where do we expect this pipeline to keep coming from, right?
Absolutely. So the private equity industry participants on this webinar today, you've been asked a question. You need to do some thinking, big thinking at your next board meeting. Nikita, I hope that what Lauren said answers your question that you put in the Q&A for us around, the view of the panel on entrepreneurship and small business development as a path for youth out of unemployment. I think in South Africa specifically, we understand this massive role that small and medium-sized enterprises play, not just in furthering our economy, and we're going to see how much more that important becomes in this post-COVID-19 world, but also from a training perspective and providing these job opportunities for our unemployed youth. Ben, I think you have raised your hand again and it's gone away. Did you still want to speak to us? Yes, you did. I'm going to allow you to talk, Ben. Unmute yourself. Go for it.
Thanks, Melanie. I was loving what Ropilang and Lauren were saying. So, because we are at a SEFCA sponsored event, Ropilang, I think the solution is if SEFCA had to kind of like lead an initiative clearly to do something about the unemployed youth, right? I'm not saying do it, I'm just saying lead it. And I agree with you. I think the work that SEFCA is doing, though, to hopefully mobilize more capital towards private markets, which is this Regulation 28 amendment, so I'm fully behind them. But I think if we had to mix maybe technology in terms of a platform to match demand and supply, because I agree with Lauren, when we started this panel, I was getting a bit concerned with the view that the solution to unemployment resides in the big corporates, because I come from the view that we do need a structural reform of our economy. A normal economy is less oligopoly and more SMME, as we see in other markets. But your point, Lauren, that the skilling, the upskilling that and the training that takes place in the small companies is not really recognized. But then Melanie runs this fund manager development program, and clearly there's cost constraints, right, in relation to employing people. So I'm asking, why don't we get creative and think about contracting? So we measure demand from the pool of unemployed people. We put them through a platform where we can skill verify them and whatever. We use maybe SEFCA to access supply for us from the many private equity and venture capital companies that need investment skill and lawyers and whatever. And we get creative that way. What do you think of that?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think one thing that already came out of the conversation a little bit is that there's just a little bit of fragmentation, and I think SAFCA is in a great position because of the membership body that is part of SAFCA and could really build a consolidated platform that helps to create job opportunities for young people, and maybe also in a later stage then have this become some sort of business that is incubated by several investors that are part of the SAFCA network, because there's definitely room for consolidation of efforts, I think, and platforms such as SAFCA can definitely help along the way. I don't know what my fellow ladies think, but I think it's a really interesting thought.
I think Anaria and the panel in the chat sessions has mentioned some sort of good ideas that we could leverage there, and in how we sort of can incentivize more investment in the upskilling space. I guess my hesitation is more that we need to actually figure out another way to achieve the quality of learning outcomes that we want. Let's bear in mind that there's a lot of government-funded programs that guarantee people internships and things like that, where there's the CETAs and things. And even with all of that, we're not getting the quality we wanted. So people with CETA accredited qualifications are not necessarily better able to perform. Our signaling isn't working out. And even if we keep funding and putting sort of contributions towards training organizations, I'm still worried and coming back to what do we really mean by good in the times we live in today, because I'm pretty convinced that the existing programs and the CETA platforms haven't delivered us the quality that employers seek.
I think that's a very fair point. Sorry, Lauren.
Yeah, it is a very fair point, and I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done around signaling and ensuring that what we're looking for in terms of signals to employers doesn't rely necessarily on certification, whether that's a matric certification with higher grade maths and science, or whether that's a degree or an internship or whatever it is, that there's different ways of assessing young people's potential when they come into the workplace. And there's some very interesting work that's being done around that. But broadly, I support the point that was made that having that addressing that intermediation issue is crucial. And that is what some of the work of the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention is doing. And I think given that it's coming from state, maybe there's some concerns about it from an implementation point of view, but having worked in the space for a long time, I'm really excited about it, that they've got the right people on board, that they're working with the right partners. I think what is going to be crucial then is linking with the demand side with employers and bringing employers on board into that Presidential Youth Employment Intervention. And so that's probably something that can be taken forward at a later stage. I do think that the point that Nikita was making about entrepreneurship wasn't necessarily about the role of small businesses as I was talking about it, but of young people being entrepreneurs themselves. And I'm not sure if that's something you'd want to circle back to, or whether that's something we can pick up in a separate discussion.
No, absolutely, because Nikita actually raised her hand and I was just going to give her an opportunity to speak to us. So Nikita, I had you here at the top of my list. I'm just going to, there we go. If you can just unmute yourself and have a chat with us quick.
Okay, well, thanks. Sorry to disappoint you. I'm not a lady. But I'd agree with both Lauren and Rapeleng in terms of the firstly, the CETA is not providing the kind of training that is required for businesses to accept youth. And I've been dealing with trying to look at how do you get small businesses to support internships in their companies? And it's very difficult, because even if you give them some financial assistance in terms of stipends, usually the problem is that the typical small business or the owner of the typical small business doesn't have the time to actually dedicate for proper training of his staff, let alone somebody that's an intern coming in. So they almost want somebody who is already experienced. And the challenge is to get that experience for a youth to start their own business, because starting from scratch for a youth with no experience in any business is very difficult. The ideal would be to gain some internship in a small business, small company, and especially because whilst on the one hand there's no opportunities, or rather the owners don't have the time to train them and shy away from it, the amount of actual knowledge you gain in a small business, because you are both the sweeper, the coffee maker, the administrator, the computer fundi, and everything else, is actually very invaluable. So how do we get to the stage where there's enough incentive for small businesses to take on youth for their internship? And that's what I'm grappling with. Thanks.
I personally think that there's probably also a little bit of an experience curve that we need to be patient for, because as businesses grow, they build more muscle to be able to absorb young talent. And I think that there are ways to accelerate that, but there are still, as long as you're a business of a certain size, that general cost benefit consideration that they're implicitly making of, okay, how much do I have to put in for this person to add value in my organization versus what I'm getting out. And I think for a good number of businesses, if they're below the $50 million revenue range, it's likely just not going to work. And as a result, they do look for a lot of experienced talent. So I absolutely agree that there's this mismatch. But that is why I personally found the proposal that was put forward to SAFCO earlier by Ben quite interesting, because I think what we've been realizing is that there are so many organizations that are actually very keen to do it if there's a platform that they can hire from where they know, okay, once the talent is coming from here, I know that they're to a certain standard and that the additional training I have to put in is not that much anymore. So, you know, if we try to create more organizations or platforms like this that can prepare the talent before they come into this type of business, then I think you could somehow bridge that gap a little bit. And I think that this also doesn't have to be super capital intensive, because if you, for instance, look at financial analysis or analytics, that's something, if you find a good young person who's motivated, within 2 to 3 months, they can actually come a long way of achieving a skill level that will then add value to the organization. So maybe that's something we need to think more about, how we create consolidated platforms where such talent can be trained before it gets brought into such businesses.
I would definitely.
One, I think. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Rapelang. I thought it was a good segue for yours. So go ahead.
It's a really, really tough one, that, because I know certainly managing a startup myself, you always get sort of these offers for, you'll bring in an intern, you don't have to pay them, they're being paid for 3 months. And the calculation in our heads is, okay, for 3 months, I'm investing sort of in upskilling this person. And then, you know, they're gone. They're not giving me a material long-term capacity. So even that 3 months for free rarely works unless I really have a very short-term project. And the management oversight is a significant cost for a small business to then actually be providing to upskill people. And I don't quite have the answer for this yet, but it's a really, really hard one to crack.
But I also think that the idea of free internships is generally a bit flawed. I personally don't believe in unpaid work, because the entire incentive structure is already wrong from the start. And I don't think that I've ever seen an example where this works particularly well. I think generally the question is whether it's the concept of internships that we need to look at. In my opinion, if you want to get people basic job experience and understand, you know, professional surroundings, they can also work in a restaurant. So for summer when they have a school break or something. But when it comes to a startup or a business that is into services or whatsoever, I do think that internships are a hard sell in most cases. I think the question rather is, how can I create permanent positions for young talent where I can confidently hire someone without being disappointed? Because the risk is, of course, higher if I make a permanent hiring decision, which means that you need to be even more assured that the person you're bringing in has the right skill level. But at the same time, it then, when it works, becomes a much more interesting business case, because you know you have the person for a while.
Absolutely. And Rapelang Madisa Matabela made a point earlier, and she gave you kudos. So for one of the things that you said around us doing our benchmarking against the best in the world, whose economies are very different from ours as developing countries. To solve African problems, we need to generate African solutions, and we need the courage to drive these ideas without seeing them work everywhere else. They could be, and very much should be, the first of their kind globally. And I think that's the opportunity we do have here, is to do something that fits Africa.
Yeah, we definitely do. And the human capital crisis is much bigger here than any other continent. And we can't be waiting for answers to come out of elsewhere. One of the big opportunities I think we have is that the learning space is sort of still in the early stages using technology. We understand one aspect of learning well, which is knowledge transfer. And that's where all the Facebooks and the guys are investing in personalized learning that gives you rapid feedback. And there's lots of evidence for that. But there's a whole other category of learning around experiential learning. And I believe that there's a profound opportunity here to leverage virtual reality and augmented reality experiences to bridge some of that gap. One of the early stage projects we're trying to get funding for and explore is how we could provide VR environments for artisans in the renewable energy space to be able to apply the theoretical training around solar panel installations and other renewable energy technologies that they have to use. And instead of waiting for a TVET to have the right equipment, instead of waiting for access to a schedule that allows you to go in and have access to those workshops, what if we could really shift towards dematerializing a lot of that experience? And in my mind, packaging experiences is the next biggest challenge in the education space, so that it's not just technical training, like I've mentioned, but there's some very cool startups in the UK looking at how you create or build more essential skills like communication. They've got an environment, for example, where people can practice negotiating contracts or practicing how you fire someone even. And you would be in an environment where you're interacting with a semi-AI driven human. And I think these are really crucial when we think about how we can apply it to young people in South Africa. Could we not create environments where they can practice doing I'm saying that the experiential gap is huge, and we need to be pioneering how we close some of that.
Yeah, it's such an important point. Those dinner time conversations. I know that was part of my upbringing. I was privileged enough to have that in my home. I mean, that was one of the biggest learnings for me. That's where I got most of my insight at an early age. You know, what you think about what you know about. So, yeah, very, very important. Well raised. I'm just having a look quickly at the Q&A box. I think I've missed one. Apologies, I'm a bit slow here. So Anna Ria, thank you for your comment around tax. I think we've dealt with that, but thank you for lending your expertise for free there. Not often that it happens from a lawyer perspective, so we appreciate it. Neil, via LinkedIn, you've made a comment here saying, if companies start realizing that the youth represent their future customers, it's sensible to invest in youth at school level to vest brand recognition. Yes, the fruits will only be evident sometime later, but it's invaluable for sustained growth. It's simple. Skills coincide with higher paid jobs. Higher paying jobs increase disposable income, and when you invest in youth, they will spend more with your company in the future. Sounds simple enough.
My worry is that I think where South African large corporations are simply not looking in those horizons. Until we change the incentive structures of large corporations, I don't think that people are going to be looking that far ahead. I mean, they're not even looking far ahead to say in 3 years, these jobs are going to be made redundant and automated. So how do we start reskilling? Which is why we're seeing the mass retrenchments in large corporations today, because 5 years ago, they knew this was coming, but even then they were not incentivized to invest 5 years forward. And I think a lot of it has to do with, incentive and bonus structures that do look on annual things. So why must I risk my neck house on a program for 5 years when I can do something that guarantees my bonus next year? We haven't set up those structures in the organizations that have the muscle to do this. And it's a really worrying thing because our horizons are far too short.
Absolutely, 100% agreed. And we've seen the big organizations just cruise their way through it. Lauren, did you want to add?
I think another key challenge is that we tend to rely on government to do all of this, and despite being let down a number of times, we still are saying government must solve this, government must solve this, government must lead on this, and of course government has a role to play. But I think what we're seeing now is that private sector is coming to the party more and more. And we're seeing, because the private sector knows what is needed from an employer point of view, that we're seeing some really nice stuff coming out in terms of skills training and understanding the space. And that's something that we need to drive more of, instead of relying solely on the state to drive these, and when the state drives, it has the capacity to bring organizations and departments together, but often is very bureaucratic and slow to respond, and uses models that are perhaps outdated, as we've talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the private sector would know best what are the skills that are lacking that is required, and their input into what our education system does or doesn't teach, I think, is fundamentally important in this conversation. I'm not 100% sure whether our education curriculums are going to survive COVID-19. And if we have the right intellectual capacity driving the conversation around, need to reform that, and how we need to reform that from a South Africa specific perspective as well as from a continental perspective. So I know that we're slowly but surely running out of time here. I wanted to give everybody a last opportunity to put some questions in the chat box or thoughts in the Q&A box, before I give the ladies a last opportunity to just give us their thoughts on some of the smaller and maybe the bigger things that our participants on the webinar today can think about if they want to start becoming actively involved in addressing this crisis. And shall I start in the same way I had you guys introduce yourselves? So Lauren, shall I start with you and ask you to share your thoughts on that point?
I think the last point that I would just like to make is that when we're thinking about the way forward and the exciting opportunities that there are when we're basically restarting from scratch, is that it's so important that we don't forget about young people who are consistently overlooked and underserved. And really, when we talk about unemployed youth, it's a big number, and there's a lot of differentiation within there, and there are groups within there that are consistently overlooked, that consistently face higher levels of barriers. And whenever we're thinking about interventions, we need to be thinking about those young people who we so often just discard and say they're a lost cause, but they're not. They're passionate, they want to make a difference, they want to exit poverty, they want to be supporting their families, and we can't leave them behind. So whatever intervention we're looking at, we have to be looking at how do we reach those young people.
Rapelang?
Oh, I thought you were going in the other order. Sure. I guess my last parting thought would be that I think now that we've been forced to experience an online digital world, when it comes to skilling and the like, and we know what the offline world looks like, I'm hoping that going forward, we now understand that actually both have a valid contribution. So how do we think in a more nuanced way about what we choose to do in the classroom versus what we choose to do online versus what we choose to do in virtual reality, and until we get to a more sophisticated sort of conversation in terms of what learning outcomes are best achieved in which learning environment, then we can actually fully leverage this experience of having gone through COVID.
Fully agree. Yasmin is our partner on this webinar and the person who came to us with this idea around starting the conversation around youth unemployment. Any final words of wisdom for our participants?
Well, words of wisdom, maybe rather words of learning as well. First of all, I'd like to thank you as the partner for putting together with us. It's been a really great discussion. I'm also very proud that we have an all-female panel, and I think it was a really engaging discussion. I think for me, the three key takeaways, and some of them are also learnings from this conversation, are One, that I really think there's opportunity for consolidation. I think what Lauren said earlier is also so crucial. We look to government to see how they can fix things, but how can we fix things ourselves and work together? Because we have a lot of force together as a private sector to build bigger solutions. The second thing for me really is thinking bigger. This is what I came with and leave with. But I really believe in looking beyond national borders and making borders more invisible for employment, because I think that this can go a long way of addressing the mismatch between demand and supply. I think the third thing for me is mostly about the onus on investors, PE, VC, whichever type of investor, to be a strong partner for human capital development for existing businesses. As I said earlier, I think that's already happening, but there's even more that we can do. And we need to appreciate more that no company that is not a people company will survive the next 10 years.
Fantastic. So investor owners to think big through and to self-empower through consolidation. I love that. I love that. To our panelists, Lauren, Rapeleng, Yasmin, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts, your expertise, your learnings with our membership base today. I see, Lauren, that you've put into the chat box some interesting reading. Have a look there quickly before we shut down the webinar. Have a look there, read up on it, reach out to us if you want to engage with any of our panelists today. You are very welcome to reach out to them directly or to ask us to put you in touch with them. I want to thank each and every one of you, and I hope this is the beginning of a conversation that leads to some really impactful changes and opportunities for our youth here in South Africa and on the continent. Thank you so much, ladies. And we'll see you soon. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.